Greetings, young inklings. Dad is back. Now, warning on this rant, and the title of this rant is The Hidden Danger of the 15-Minute City. This rant is more based on conjecture than the normal rants. For this reason, it is more important than ever that you employ our evidence-based reasoning strategy. If it makes sense, run with it. If it doesn't make sense, kick it to the curb. If you like what you hear, share it. If you love what you hear, please subscribe. It's free, and it helps me to do a whole lot more of these. That said, let's hop to it. My guess, kiddos, is that you've never heard the term 15-minute city. But before providing you with the definition of this term, I think it'll be useful to provide you with some personal historical experience. Here goes. When I was in the 8th grade, I began to develop a fascination with communism in what was called in the 1940s through the 1980s the Eastern Bloc. The term Eastern Bloc referred to the Soviet Union and the countries under its control from 1945 to 1989. Think of countries like Romania, Latvia, Ukraine, Belarus, Poland, Hungary, Kazakhstan, Estonia, Armenia, and Albania. And this is a short list. There were many more countries that served as puppet states for the evil empire known as the Soviet Union. I began to read about people like Alexander Solzhenitsyn, Fyodor Dostoevsky, and Andrei Sakharov. Movies like Dr. Zhivago further drove my interest in learning more about what life was like behind the Iron Curtain. When I attended college, I took several history courses that focused on life in the Soviet Union. One of them was taught by a professor who was a dissident who escaped from the Soviet Union. I was riveted by his descriptions of life in the USSR. One of the things that fascinated me most about life behind the Iron Curtain was that the government was highly restrictive on the ability of its citizens to move about freely. I was just amazed by the concept that the citizens of these countries had to get permission to move within their own cities or between their cities. I just couldn't fathom what life would be like. We had to ask our government permission if I wanted to travel to California, Texas, or Idaho. I simply couldn't imagine having to get permission from a government lackey just to drive across town and visit a relative. I was even further amazed as I came to understand that the only citizens who were allowed to travel in the Soviet Union were those citizens whose ideas conformed with those of the state. I found this to be astonishing and scary. In the antebellum South, slaves were not allowed to travel without permission. Communism in the Soviet Union during the 20th century was indeed not much different from slavery in the United States in the 19th century. My Russian professor explained that the reason the state was so restrictive on the ability of citizens to move about freely was that freedom of physical movement also meant the freedom of idea movement as well. Remember, there was no telephones back then. In order for the state to maintain the illusion that communism was working, the state had to also control the narrative. The best way to control the narrative was to control the ability of the population to communicate. And the best way to control the ability of the population to communicate was to control the ability of the population to move about freely. Now, the USSR had done a brilliant job of controlling the narrative by only allowing state-sponsored media. The only press available to the public were the newspapers Izvestia and Pravda. Of course, these quote-unquote organs of the state supplied quote-unquote news that was really not news, but only propaganda designed to further the ends of the state. In other words, lies. Of course, telephone lines were tapped by government spies, and the postal service was run by the government, and all mail was scrutinized and read by government lackeys. So speaking on the phone or writing letters on topics that offended the government was a risky business, to say the least. That's how you can wind up in the gulag. So the only way to communicate ideas freely via person was in person-to-person contact. But remember, the state employed a massive number of citizens to supply on their fellow citizens. So even meeting in person to share ideas that were not in alignment with the state propaganda was also very risky. Many a Soviet citizen was sent to the gulag for 10 years because their friend turned out to be a government hack who ratted them out. In fact, Solzhenitsyn himself spent 10 years in the Siberian gulag. His crime, you ask? While he was in the army, he wrote a letter to a friend about the appalling conditions in the Soviet military. A postal spy read his letter and reported him to the authorities. For this, he nearly lost his life in the gulag. Now, with all that as background, let's get into the title of this rant, The 15-Minute City. This concept simply means that the government should structure life for its citizens so that everything that the citizen needs is within 15 minutes of where he lives. In theory, this would mean that everything the citizen needs would be within a 15-minute walk, a 15-minute bike ride, or a 15-minute public transit ride of where you live. Now, as usual with leftists, these ideas always sound great on the surface, kind of like the free school and free medicine. Who would want free school or free medicine? But of course, life is full of trade-offs. There ain't no free lunches, as the saying goes. We certainly learned this the hard way with public school. And remember with leftists, it's never about you freely choosing to structure your life that way. It's about them forcing you to live your life that way. And I suspect that this all comes with a very dark ulterior motive. Let's use Portlandia as an example. Portland is a model for what the radicals will look to do to the rest of the country. For over 30 years, and I've watched this with my own eyes, local government in Portland began refusing to expand the freeway system, thereby creating artificial traffic congestion in the city. As the city's grown massively over the past 30 years, really 60 years, not a single lane of freeway has been added to the freeway system in 30 years. Portland has to be the largest city in the country, with only one east-west arterial and only two north-south arterials. This has not changed since 1984. Not one lane of freeway traffic added since 1984. And this is in a city bisected by a major river, two rivers if you count the Columbia River to the north. So Portland now is a traffic hell. To add to the fun, the city's reduced the number of lanes on many of its major streets to allow a lane for bicycles only. This is madness if the objective is to ease travel around the city, but it's brilliant if the goal is to create traffic misery so as to force people out of their cars and into public transportation. The city recently spent millions on a new bridge that is only accessible by pedestrians, bicycles, and public transportation. And remember, it spent this money at a time when rush hour traffic has become intolerable. Clearly, the city's leadership cares not one whit for the interests of its citizens. It is only focused on executing its ideological goals. And the ideological goal is to force people out of their cars and into public transportation or into bicycles. Now, they will tell you that this is an admirable goal because it's good for the environment. On the surface, this sounds logical. And after all, the fewer the number of cars, the less the carbon emissions. But upon further scrutiny, that doesn't make sense. Think of how leftist leadership has responded to energy innovations. Every time a new technology comes along that reduces pollution or reduces the cost of energy extraction, they immediately find a new apocalyptic disaster to impede its use. For example, the newly found technology of fracking will apparently cause the earth to collapse on itself. Tapping into the reserves in Alaska would cause dramatic risks to the environment. Tapping into the new reserves found on our coastline would be too risky for the environment. Nuclear energy is too risky. The list goes on. The automotive industry has done a marvelous job of increasing gas mileage and reducing emissions over the last decades, but that doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is moving people from cars to public transportation. But the leftists have no problem with electric cars. Never mind that they are outrageously expensive, or that the lithium mined for the batteries for those cars is destructive to the environment, or the labor used to acquire the lithium comes from dark-skinned people working for slave wages. This should tell you that it's not really about the environment at all. If the left really cared about the environment, they would not be promoting the mining of lithium using black slaves to access the key components for the electric cars. The reason they're willing to overlook these issues with electric cars is that electric cars are much more controllable by the government than the traditional combustion engine car. For example, if or when the government decides to restrict your ability to move about the country, all they need to do is shut off the access to the electrical grid and your electrical cars will not move. However, if you have a traditional car, it's much more difficult to restrict your ability to move about. Similarly, public transportation is obviously much more controllable by the tyrannical government. Whenever the government decides that you cannot move about, they simply turn off the public transportation and you are stuck living in your 15-minute slave plantation. The other fact that tells you that it's not about the environment is that they never demonize the largest polluters in the world, China and India. They only demonize the United States. If they were truly interested in reducing pollution, they would focus on the world's largest polluters, but nary a word is said about those countries. So if the war on the energy industry is not about the environment, what is it about? I submit to you, it's about controlling the ability of free citizens to move about their own countries. It's about creating the 15-minute city. Because if the government can control your ability to move, it can also control the ability for ideas to move. The goal of these tyrants is to create slavery. And slaves in every time and every place in human history have never possessed the ability to move about freely. Eliminating your ability to move about freely is a necessary precondition to achieving the goals of the evil intellectual elite. With leftists, it's always and everywhere and in every time about control, control, control. Let me provide you with a personal story that illustrates how close the local government came to imposing the Soviet-style slavery here at home. In the fall of 2020, your mom had an appointment at the local hospital. Now remember, this is when the government-induced lockdowns were in full effect. If you recall, you could not be seen in public without wearing a filthy 50-cent Walmart face rag that we were told was technologically sufficient to start up a microbe 1/10,000th the width of a human hair. Unbelievable, but I digress. While in the waiting room, I noticed that there was a map on the table at the check-in desk. There was a questionnaire adjacent to the map. I assumed the questionnaire was asking if the patient had traveled outside the country. This was a logical conclusion, as international travel exposes one to potential bacteria and diseases that are not native to the United States. But as I looked more closely at the map, I realized the map was not an international map, but a map of the counties in southwest Washington. I reflected on the education I had received from my old Russian professor, and for the first time in my life, I felt a true sense of dread. The reason for my fear is that I immediately began to understand what the radical left was seeking to implement. It dawned on me that my local government was preparing to restrict the movement of local citizens to their county of residence only. I began to understand that one of the motives for creating the false pandemic was to create a reason to keep citizens from moving about freely. By locking down freedom of movement, the government can control the free movement of ideas. Once locked into your own home, the only ideas a citizen will have access to are the ideas streamed into their homes by big media. Big media is now simply an arm of the government. Fox News, ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, MSNBC are all the U.S. equivalent to Izvestia, Pravda, and the old Soviet Union during the Cold War. They are mouthpieces for the filthy government. And the government already controls access to the information technology vehicles. Look how they are blocking access to views in YouTube, Facebook, TikTok, Twitter, and the rest. Having assumed ownership of the vehicles for ideas dissemination, the only thing left to control by the evil intellectual elite was the citizens' ability to have direct communication. The only way to accomplish this is to restrict the ability of citizens to move about freely. Now, for the evil elite, how can you restrict the movement of freedom-loving people like American citizens? Well, how about using the virus as an excuse to lock down the freedom of movement? It's absolutely brilliant. I don't care if this was a part of the original strategy or if the evil elite simply took advantage of the situation. In the words of Rahm Emanuel, never let a good crisis go to waste. And what a great crisis COVID provided them. Many people stayed in their homes, fearing for their very lives. While locked in their homes, they stared 24/7 at the government-sponsored fear-mongering lying media. The radicals were able to accomplish two strategic initiatives with the COVID strategy. First, they were able to prevent the movement of ideas by reducing the movement of the population. Secondly, by doing so, they were able to control the ideas the population did receive by controlling the information that flowed into their homes via big media. Stalin, Lenin, Hitler, Mao, Pol Pot, Mugabe, Castro, and all the other 20th century thug tyrants, eat your respective heart outs. This current crop of communist thugs are taking your evil genius to the next level. Whew, sports fans, I genuinely didn't think this rant would be this long. Let me summarize the key lessons learned from this rant. First, the ultimate objective of the 15-Minute City Project is to eliminate the ability of citizens to move about the country. Two, the reason for this is the ability to eliminate the ability for ideas unimproved by the government to be communicated among the population. Three, with leftists, it's always everywhere and at all times about power and control. All leftist ideas will be sold leading with the benefits, never with the cost of said benefits or who will pay for them. And finally, the sole objective of the environmental movement among the Marxist elite is to eliminate the ability of the population to move about the country. By eliminating freedom, the government can also eliminate the freedom of expression. All tyrants need to control the narrative to succeed. Of course, I could be wrong. You might have read this and concluded that dad is full of bovine scatology. But homie, I don't think so. P.S. before I leave. Remember when we watched the Chinese lock down entire cities in their country a couple of years ago? Remember the extreme high density these people were experiencing? It seemed as if all the 1.3 billion Chinese citizens lived in high-rise condos, which means, of course, that the population will be very easy to control. The easiest people for the government to control are those who live in cities and high-density living arrangements. The most difficult people for the country to control will be those people who live in low-density areas. Remember the Chinese media showing robots walking through their cities demanding, via loudspeaker system, that the citizens stay in their homes for weeks on end. This is easy to do with city dwellers. It's very difficult to do with rural dwellers, which is why the intellectual elite hates people who live in rural areas and loves to call them names and call them stupid and make fun of them and call them deplorables like girlfriend Hillary Clinton. But that's all for now. It's time for Dad to check out. Peace out. Ciao.